Find that within the industrial policy itself, as defined by within literature, it's meant that government is going to make a deliberate effort to actually promote industry through either putting in the effective or at least good tariffs that are going to motivate industry or trade, put in place either tax relief, but we can see when the tax relief is a bit skewed to who it benefits, not necessarily those who are actually supposed to support the base of the industry itself, but find that even the tax relief is benefiting a certain category within the government itself. So I find that some of these issues have to actually be looked at in terms of the feasibility of the policy itself working for what it is meant to do. And then we find that actually industrial development will also not work if our institutions or the industry institutions are actually failing. And industrial policy must also be sensitive to the country context specific, like the binding constraints. We cannot say the binding constraints for Tanzania will hold the same binding constraints for Uganda, and we map it in that way. So we need to understand our country and what is causing these impediments to such that way we can look at them to support industrial growth. So we find that evidence even from the World Economic Forum shows that there is a correlation between the countries that have strong institutions to how they also appear on the global competitive index. And that was very clear from what our Kidney Sipa said when they gave us the question of Denmark. If you can postulate the growth of Denmark within the short time span, it's not changing. But again, it's because the institutions are very clear and very transparent. But can that be done for us in terms of the competitive index? So again, you find that institutions within literature have been grouped around three aspects: those that are economic, those that are political, and those that have the political power. That's the muscle. And that the political power comes in terms of, say, like, here it's CCM, back home it's NRM. So if CCM or NRM has its manifesto and we know it's not individualized, that's the actual kind of political power we are talking about. It has, as an institution, it has a role it plays in building the sector bases. And then the economic institutions, which I'm not going into detail, which I think we are all aware, and the political institutions, which can also be individualized, or the land property rights, or within the framework of creating the enabling environment, such as the cabinet or the parliament. So as we argued yesterday, institutions actually help to define the rules of the game. They might not be, because as the deals, you see the deals, they can go out of the rules of the game. But again, usually if you notice, if the deals fail, or if they want to hold you accountable, usually they'll go back to the rules. If there's something which has failed somewhere within the deal, they'll go back to the rules within the institutions to hold those deal breakers accountable. So to create an environment for development, industrial growth, and wealth creation, we need the right legal and administrative arms of government to be well-functioning and free from political pressure. But political pressure can be supportive, but can also be destructive. We need committed and answerable people to who they serve. Like the president needs to know that he's serving us, not his own ideology, but he needs to serve as we Ugandans need to hold him accountable, and he should be able to know that we can hold him accountable and he accepts, not the other way around, that we need to be working for him. So without well-functioning, well-coordinated institutions, we find that actually industries usually do not take off. And this is what I try to put into the perspective. If you find institutions need to push industry, well-functioning institutions will create that lever for the institutions to spark off. And that's what is actually happening. But we usually find the opposite is happening within our economies. So what are the dynamics at the macro level within the economy? We find we want to drive industry. But to drive industry, that means we have to grow the export. And we have to see our deficit reducing. But over time, we are seeing our import base actually outgrowing the export base, leading to the lever. We are seeing the deficit is actually weighing us down. And this has an implication on how much our industry is actually performing. That if our industry is still remaining in its cocoon of business as usual, then this trade deficit is going to continue pressing us down further and further. And we see a close relation between the depreciation of the Ugandan shilling and the export growth. The moment the exports are actually declining, we see the shilling also weakening. And this is something which is critical. So we see the core movements between export growth and the depreciation of the shilling, implying that when exports actually fall, our shilling actually depreciates. And this is a role of industry, which has to drive these exports. So what is the performance of the industry within our economy? I'll look at the broad picture for now. We find that, at least for the last 10 years, maybe which I've not shown you today, is between 2010 to 2000 and 2010, actually Uganda was growing at around 13% of GDP. But for the last 5 years, we're actually averaging at 4.5. I do not know if we are going to go into that, the disease of no growth or negative growth, but this is something which needs to make us wake up. But again, high GDP growth rates doesn't necessarily mean that you're not well off, because we've seen Denmark with 1.2 over time, but the economy is pretty good. So it's not, the growth needs to be reflected with what is happening downstream. So we find that what is driving actually our growth right now is industry and services. But there are so many intricacies within these two sectors that also need to be diversified to understand the dynamics that are happening within industry and services for us to begin posing about that really is industry actually driving our growth. But what is within industry, if it can have no spillovers, then there's nothing for us to brag about at the end of the day. So when we look at the actual activities taking place within these three sectors, I could not present for you only industry without understanding the other two broad sectors. That's agriculture and services. We see within the share contribution to GDP, recall, GDP annual growth rate was so low. It was it was averaging, you see the green, around 2.3. But you can see even its sectoral contribution is a bit higher than industry, despite its having the lowest GDP share to the annual GDP composition. And services, that's the other graph on the, I don't know if you'll be seeing here, this one. We have services continuing being the biggest share to GDP, but again, the opposite comes in when we look at its contribution to social inclusion. That's issues related to employment. We find still the economy is being anchored within agriculture in terms of livelihoods. And industry, that is having the highest contribution to annual GDP growth rates, has the smallest component to social inclusion aspects related to employment, which is followed also by the services. So these issues are the kind of issues that saying that we will actually not have any form of growth if we actually divert away from agriculture. We're not seeing any transformation. If transformation within agriculture is not tackled for an economy that's agro-based, then we shall not see transformation upstream. That's within the industry itself. So when you look at the actual, I want to diversify what's happening within industry itself. So we've seen industry is being the highest contributor to annual GDP. Industry is being among the smallest within employment, and also one of the smallest within is sectoral contribution to GDP shares. But what is happening here, if you break down what is happening within industry? If you look at the annual growth rate of industry activities themselves, activities like mining, activities like electricity, despite their even negative annual GDP shares, they actually are growing, and yet they're small. You find you notice on this aspect, when mining was actually growing in a negative, its GDP share was still positive. When you see, when we come and argue that actually manufacturing is the biggest share contributor to GDP, its actual growth is actually not yielding much, implying what is happening in manufacturing. Manufacturing is not expanding fast enough. We see its share to GDP is high, yes, but within its growth, the growth is not actually happening within manufacturing as an economy. So we find growth happening in places like mining, electricity. But again, there is a story around this. These are two sectors that have the highest FDI, with limited back and forward linkages with agriculture. So any small investment within electricity and mining are probably going to push up this annual, we will say, oh, they're growing, but probably only 2 investments within these sectors. That's actually pushing up the GDP growth shares. So not necessarily that it's actually having any expansion per se, but it's the amount of FDI involved in these sectors. But so you find that whereas the other graph is showing, as to emphasize, that manufacturing is still the biggest share to contribution to GDP, its agro growth is dismal. It's actually not growing. And that's where the economy is saying we're going to be export-led, but through agriculture, when manufacturing is not growing, to absorb the youth. So we go down to also diversify what is happening within this manufacturing. If you look at the index of industrial production, food processing is accounting at least for 40% of this weight. And any changes within food processing cause the whole of the manufacturing not to grow down upstream. So you find other aspects that even will grow, such as the bricks and cement, or the textile, which is also a little bit dismal, is not having the biggest impact to manufacturing growth compared to the food processing. So if we do not tackle the aspects that relate to value addition in food processing sustainably, then manufacturing as a whole will also see the little expansion that we are seeing and growth upstream at industrial level. So we, as government, as an institution of government, they are trying to say that we need to promote this, the agro-processing. So they go ahead, and according to the presidential directive, as someone here argued yesterday that they're having rotting fruits, the president says we need to put up a fruit factory in this location, I think to make even people happy, you know. It was prior to votes. And then we need to put up an Irish potato factory within the Kisoro district, because the biggest producer of Irish potato. We need the crisp industry. But again, if you look at the dynamics within this, you find the plans are not well conceived, mainly because the quality of input matters for the industry. No matter how much you have rotting mangoes or oranges somewhere, for an industry to proceed, it requires the same quality of orange, the same quality of mango. That's why the juice taste does not change. But our farmers are producing different qualities. Yes, they're all mangoes, but they're not the same. So you find that industry, sustaining that industry within that place is not going to be sustainable, because the quality and the type of mango, despite them being in plenty, they're different. And as people advocated for, it will not matter even if you put up that industry. If I open this box, this is a different mango, this is a different mango, this is a different mango, and the type of industry put in place takes a certain type. So unless government comes in to distribute and make uniformity for the industry to come in to buy the same issues for within that area, then still these aspects of putting in and ad hoc industries across even what Uganda is going to do will still not yield much. And that is the argument I'm making. So we have what they call the operational wealth creation back home. It's distributing inputs to these farmers. But there is no way the inputs are related to industry. They're distributing, let's say, an avocado tree, a mango tree, but they're trying to ensure food security. But imagine the economy is saying they want to increase industry and agro-processing. But what they are distributing is in different directions. So you find most of these initiatives are actually not functioning. They're just expensive. So just by Monday, to give you the case, the New Vision published, the citrus and tomato factory has closed. But what were the dynamics around that? The factory was commissioned, of course, definitely by the president in 2014. The products from that factory are only selling within the rural economy there. They're not actually linked to the upper market. And the Uganda National Bureau of Standards refused to certify them because the quality was bad. And yet to build industrial base, you have to ensure local markets or local consumers can take your goods. You need to look within before you look out. If the quality cannot be sustained within, then definitely outside, you'll also not be able to sell or be viable as a competitor. So you find who's owning this. The majority shareholder of this industry is the president's brother, who is also in charge of the operational wealth creation, who is also in charge of being the presidential advisor on these issues. So what were the dynamics of opening this when that's the viability of looking at the economic gains of this industry? So we find that how are we performing now on the business within the global context? Yes, we have improved in terms of doing business, and mainly, but still we are still below the 100 countries performing those 10 indicators of doing business. But we have seen an improvement in getting credit, which is a bit positive. So we need to, I think probably because of the mobile money transfers, nothing else in terms of either bank expansion, but it's because the form of credit you need is big. And yet, to invest big, you need big money, and we do not have that yet. So we find that within the East African community, our issues around processing, procedures in business processing are still the highest. We even have in business registration, we still have the highest in terms of when you're trying to open a business. So despite the fact that we are trying to improve, we still have impediments downstream. In terms of governance, I'll just skip to the biggest one about this, is I'll put the alarm. Now it is 20 minutes. Give me 5 more and then I'll get this done. So we find around how we're performing on governance, other than we are actually below the required performance indicator. We've never hit the 50th percentile mark, even in regulatory performance, which is the best. It's around 39% at the global level. And you look at the control of corruption, even what the Ibrahim Index puts us, Uganda is the 12th most corrupt country by 2014. And if you're corrupt, as we're saying, it's an indication of institutions not being held accountable or functioning. So what we find that as the binding constraints in this whole setup of institutional frameworks, we have human capital. Definitely this is literature which has been compiled even within the World Bank. We have electricity access, finance, land rights, but probably for Uganda, as some Professor Francois said, land is one of the biggest impediments to industry expansion and growth because of the system of the land tenure system within the country itself. So even the land rights or the land markets are actually, what do they call them, hypothetical. In terms of prices just shooting up, you cannot even know the actual land price within the country. So what are the frameworks which I've summarized for you that's actually supporting industry? We have the constitution itself, the vision, the NDP, that's the National Development Plan. We have the National Industrial Policy. These ones all have well-articulated issues. That's the best thing about this. But in terms of enforcement and going downstream to see if they are working, even at the decentralized systems, is not there. Even you look at the latest, we have what they call the Build Uganda, Buy Uganda. That means they're trying to encourage local consumption. But if you actually articulate it with even the performance upstream, it's not having an impact as a policy, even within the institutions themselves. Even the strategies are there. So you find that even the institutions that are supporting industry, because the institutions make the roles functional, the policies functional. If you look at the MDAs, those are the ministries, the departments and agencies that are actually actualizing the policies. We have the Uganda Industrial Research Institute. We have the Uganda National Chamber of Commerce, Uganda Exports Promotion. They've just put in place the Free Zones Authority, the Uganda Warehousing Receipt System, the Uganda Cleaner Production Center. If you go down and look at the mandates of these institutions, some of them are actually overlapping. And you wonder why they are there. If Uganda Investment Authority is there to actualize these industries coming, and then there is Free Zones also, which is trying to promote investment. So who will you hold accountable for the poor performance of the industry within the economy? And who's going to take the goodness in terms of if things work? Every institution wants to own the good, but no institution wants to own the bad. So there's no accountability frameworks, even within the institutions, because they have all overlapping frameworks. What is the missing link? This is the second last slide. We find we are seeing the policy, the choice of policy, the project and location is actually being driven in the political criteria and not economic. The politics within our countries actually, which can drive industries to work, actually not doing their job. So we find that the challenge has been that there are no synergies within the institutions, that Ministry of Trade and Ministry of Agriculture. Everyone does their own things. But yet we are going to drive agro-processing. But these two institutions do not have the same, they do not speak to each other in terms of the way they do their things. So the poor coordination within these institutions, which are actually duplicative, we are seeing the poor performance will probably be aligned to that aspect, that is not being aligned, and the linkages between industry and agriculture are leading to the poor performance. So the gaps between policy and implementation have always been our dead end, you know? So without addressing some of these issues, we shall see issues of corruption, political economy, the funding and supervision still being the issues being talked about within our debates. And the lack of research linking R&D to industry is also part of the panacea for our economy. So as you can see, what do we deduce from this discussion? Our institutions and industry are not actually, they are apart. They're not together, okay? So we find that we are growing, yes, but the growth is not going anywhere. Yes, it's there within industry, but there's no any expansion, or actually growth is stagnating at that same level. And that means we need to do things differently if we are to achieve this lower middle income status by 2020. So efforts by government to enhance production and those of ensuring that Uganda is industrialized are actually different. Though they are there, but I think they've never sat in the same room to realize that they need to work together to make sure this takes off. So Uganda's industry cannot take off amidst the full liberalization we are seeing, as it's also facing the same level of competition from the farms out, and yet we have low quality of inputs. The corruption, the weak governance is still there. As I've indicated, we are rated the 12th most corrupt economy in the world in 2014 by the Ibrahim Index. So it's really not something good to talk about. Though corruption, they say, can make growth, but this corruption is not making growth happen. So we need to strengthen our institutions. We need to encourage the agro-industry linkages, which are still very weak. And then the poor performance of industry, as I conclude, is actually an indication of the poor linkages, institutional linkages, and the coordination. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Madina, for that presentation on Uganda. Say something?
Blandina said, probably I'll have to discuss this with some of the individuals. But again, being entrepreneur, again, for every entrepreneur first created, the other dies. So again, it doesn't matter whether we are the highest, the second highest in even Africa. They're not sustainable because according, the death rate is pretty high as well of those institutions. But we shall discuss corruption. It's something beyond me. But thank you for raising it up.